So this is the point where we're going to start getting into much more negative interactions. As a result of the French and Indian War, and in retaliation for the Pontiac's rebellion, a group of Pennsylvanians that called themselves the Paxton Boys decided to attack a Christian Indian town in 1763. And about 50 drunken guys just went on a rampage in this town and killed about 20 innocent Susquehanna natives in western Pennsylvania. And this event was something that represented what would happen again and again, that the American colonists, as opposed to the British, were much more brutal towards Native Americans, much more willing to engage in outright massacre as a result of seeing them as more of a threat, whereas the European governments outside North America that controlled the empires, they tended to see natives as objects of opportunity, especially for getting products and things like that. They tended not to see, the officials back in England or back in France tended not to look at natives as threats to themselves. Of course, they were much further removed. Americans tended to see natives as dire threats. This Paxton Boys event in 1763 illustrated that, and illustrated the depths of the violence that the Americans were willing to engage in order to remove natives from territory. At the time, many officials in the colonies were shocked. Ben Franklin, for example, was just dismayed that his home state, Pennsylvania, had people that would do this. In any case, it did illustrate a pattern that we're going to see again going into the 19th century. And the particular natives here had nothing to do with the natives that the Paxton Boys were mad about. And we're going to see that happen more and more as Americans stop making distinctions between what natives are friendly to them and what are not. So the French and Indian War led directly to the American Revolution 13 years later, and natives were a big part of that. They were a big part of starting the French and Indian War, and they were a big part of the grievances that started the American Revolution, like the Proclamation Line of 1763. Indeed, the reason for the British increasing taxes on the Americans was to pay for the French and Indian War debts. The natives had been part of that, and one of the reasons they needed to raise taxes, the British needed to raise taxes on the Americans, was because they weren't getting the kind of return on investment from the natives that would have paid for it itself. And so those disputes, and if you take early American history, you learn more about those disputes that led to the American Revolution. Those disputes erupted into war in 1776, and a lot of the eastern and frontier natives in the Ohio country and in the southeast were put in a tough spot. They had to decide, do we support the British or do we support the Americans? The Iroquois were the most powerful military power among the natives in the eastern area of North America. They were split both ways. On the one hand, and this is a picture of Joseph Brant. Joseph Brant was an Iroquois leader who argued siding with the British. There were others who said we should side with the Americans. And they were kind of split 50-50. The same was true of the other larger groupings, such as the Cherokee and the Shawnee. Cherokee lived south in Tennessee, what's now Tennessee and Georgia. The Shawnee lived in the Ohio country in Indiana. They all decided to support Britain. Most natives did. About 4 out of 5 of natives who were involved in the American Revolution supported Britain. And this became a huge problem for them later on because the Americans would not forget it. Indeed, it was Iroquois warriors that helped the British win a number of battles in the early part of the American Revolution. When the British were winning, they were really winning most of it. But some of their big victories in 1778 and 1779 were in large part because of Iroquois assistance and their warriors being particularly effective, especially in scouting and intelligence and the ability to move quickly. So The Americans learned a lesson from this. The Americans took the message that the natives were not on their side, and thus were people that were not to be dealt with. A lot of Americans would never forget that the natives sided with the British for the most part. The Iroquois League ended up siding with the British, even though there was a dispute, and they sent agents to other native groupings, and they made what was called the Chota Agreement with various southeastern tribes, such as the Cherokee, in which they decided, we will all support Britain. That was a bad move for the Cherokee, because that was or ended up being a negative effect for them, because that was a big reason why a lot of Americans wanted the Cherokee out when they start expanding into their territory. So the aftermath of the American Revolution for natives couldn't be worse. Britain, despite winning most of the battles, they lost the war. And as a result, the natives lost most of their protection. Now Spain is the only other power in North America, and they're way down, pretty limited presence here in Florida and way over here. And so all these natives who lived in the colonial frontier, the Ohio country, and what became Kentucky and Tennessee, and the southeast, what became Mississippi, Alabama, all of them had depended on playing both ends against the middle to maintain their independence, and now they had no ends to play. And the Americans are now frothing at the mouth to expand into all this territory. And unlike the British, the Americans don't really value the native trade goods like the British or the French did. What the Americans want is to expand their civilization westward and make more towns, gather more territory, and develop it economically. So the aftermath of the American Revolution for natives was quite negative. Now, instead of being able to turn to the British for help, they're going to be left on their own to face the Americans.